The iron I cabbed the Phantom 530 didn't just feel cold, it felt used. It was stale, saturated with the metallic scent of spilled coffee going rancid, and a thin, high note of something impossibly sharp, like freezing iron dust ground into the synthetic upholstery. I stood hunched over, my breath misting violently, staring at the empty seat where Jerry should have been. The truck was running, had been running for probably 12 hours, burning through the twin 50-gallon tanks with the diesel purr that had become the soundtrack to Jerry's last night on Earth. Everything was exactly as it should have been for a quick roadside stretch. The heat blasting, the CB radio humming white noise, the logbook open on the passenger seat, except the driver was gone, utterly, irrevocably gone. This wasn't some busted coupling or a blown tire in the middle of a blizzard. That we could handle. That was the job. This was something else.
This was a sixth time this winter, and every fiber of my veteran nervous system, every hair on the back of my neck that had stood up against blizzards, black ice, and drunken hunters, was screaming that this was the moment the danger moved from statistical bad luck to deliberate malice. The recovery crew, a couple of terrified Mounties, and a heavy-duty mechanic named Frank were hanging back 50 yards, stamping their feet, talking in hushed, panicked tones into their satellite phones. They didn't want to get close to the cab. They knew the drill now. We all did. The truck was a monument to impossible desertion. What truly chilled me, beyond the absence of Jerry's thick wool coat or his emergency shotgun, was the ground outside. We were 90 miles north of the nearest maintained road, right on the edge of the tree line, where the ice road crosses the frozen-over expanse of lac brûlée. The ice here was thick, blue, and unforgiving, covered by a recent dusting of fresh powder.
But surrounding the massive dual tires of Jerry's rig was a half circle of disturbed ice, maybe 20 feet wide. It looked like someone had taken a massive rusty rake and dragged it across the surface, scraping away the fresh snow down to the polished, dark ice beneath. There were no boot prints leading away from the cab, no signs of a struggle near the steps, just those deep, unnatural gouges in the ice, curving inwards, stopping maybe 6 feet from the driver's side door, and then nothing. The silence of the high north wasn't silent at all. It was a pressurized, painful drumbeat that felt ready to shatter. I closed my eyes and whispered a curse into the frozen air. This wasn't just vanishing. This was an extraction. 3 months ago, when old man Silas first disappeared on the Yellowknife Run, we called it bad luck, hypothermia, drunk driving, the elements taking their due. That's what we do up here. We rationalize the inevitable. Silas was old, and the cold doesn't negotiate.
But Silas's truck, the mule train, had been found in pristine condition. Keys in the ignition, the engine block still warm hours later. Then came Peter, then young Maya, who just bought her own Peterbilt. All veterans, all experienced, all gone without a trace, leaving behind their running, abandoned machines like metal ghosts, and always the same impossible details. No struggle, no blood, and a strange focused chaos near the vehicle, never inside it. We live in a world defined by weight, steel, and fuel consumption. Our lives are calculated in mileage,
hours of service, and the precise temperature needed to keep a frozen shipment from thawing. The ice road is a lifeline stretching across a landscape that actively hates humanity. You learn early that the cold is your true enemy. It can freeze your brakes, crack your engine block, and turn your body into a granite statue in under an hour if you let it. We accepted that risk.
What we were facing at war now didn't operate on Celsius or friction. It felt intelligent, methodical, and hungry. The problem wasn't just the disappearance, it was the psychological erosion. Tracking is an exercise in solitude, maintained by the fragile tether of the CB radio. When you're alone for 700 miles, knowing that the nearest person is a 6-hour snowmobile ride away, the only thing you have left is your preparation and the comforting rumble of your engine. When that rumble becomes a decoy, a trap, the foundation of your world crumbles. I climbed out of Jerry's cab, pulling my collar high against the gnawing wind. Frank met me, his face pale beneath his frostbitten beard. "Anything, Eli? Logbook say anything?" Frank's voice was gravelly, strained. "He logged off at 3:15 a.m., I confirmed, pulling my heavy mitts back on. Standard safety check. He noted the temperature drop, said he was going to turn up the heater and grab 4 hours. Nothing else."
3:15, Frank repeated, wiping his nose with a jerky motion. "Always between 2 and 4, the dead zone. That was the key detail we had mapped out. The vanishing window, always in those 2 hours, when the biological clock hits its lowest point, when the cold is most absolute, and when the air is so heavy with static that the radio becomes useless white noise. It was as if the creature, or whatever it was, knew the exact moment the human spirit was most vulnerable, the second the guard dropped just enough, and the open loops kept piling up, mocking our logic. If it was a gang, why the running trucks? Why leave the highly valuable cargo, in Jerry's case, specialized mining equipment, untouched? If it was a wild animal, why the complete lack of blood, hair, or drag marks? And why, in 3 instances, were the fuel gauges drained completely dry, even though the drivers had just topped up? It defied thermodynamics.
An idling diesel engine doesn't burn through 100 gallons in a few hours. The local indigenous search team, who refused to even touch the abandoned vehicles, had warned us about the location, specifically Lac Brûlé. They called it the hunting grounds of the Chinamisque, the great cold hunger. They told us these things were not bears or wolves. They were manifestations of the raw, consuming starvation that lives beneath the ice. They said the spirits didn't just kill, they consumed the warmth, the light, and the very essence of the soul, leaving behind only the metal husk. We dismissed it initially as folklore. But folklore doesn't leave tire gouge patterns in blue ice. I remember my own encounter weeks earlier, before Jerry disappeared. I was running empty, heading south for repairs, listening to a local hockey game, trying to stay awake. It was maybe 2:30 a.m., and the moon was a perfect blinding disk, reflecting off the pristine snowfields.
I had just passed the 500 kilometers marker post when my high beams caught movement off the left shoulder. It wasn't fast, but it was unnerving. Too tall to be a moose and far too thin. It moved in a staggering side-to-side gait, perpendicular to the road, across the open tundra. I hit the air horn, a massive blast that usually sends wildlife scattering in panicked flight. This thing didn't react. It didn't turn its head, which seemed perpetually lowered toward the ground. But its long, impossible arms, they were far longer than any human's, kept swinging, almost grazing the frozen earth. As I barreled past at 40 miles an hour, I caught a glimpse of its silhouette against the moon. It was pure negative space, a jagged shadow composed of angles that shouldn't exist in nature, like a broken insect magnified 100 times. And when I checked my side mirror, it was still there, now standing stock still, impossibly close, looking directly at the retreating red lights of my trailer.
The thing that struck me wasn't its appearance, but the sound it generated. A dry, brittle clicking, like thousands of tiny frozen branches snapping in sequence, entirely drowning out the sound of my own engine for a horrifying second. I drove for another 3 hours before I could bring myself to pull over, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I finally stopped and checked my trailer seals, the clicking was gone, replaced by the usual moan of the wind. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. You don't get taken seriously up north if you start reporting tall, skinny shadows that click. But the fear became real, tangible, when Mike showed up. Mike was one of our best drivers running the Fort Hope route. He vanished 4 weeks ago. His truck was found, naturally, running, keys in, door unlocked. 2 days later, a snowmobile team found Mike 50 miles south of his rig, near an abandoned trapper's cabin. He was alive, technically.
But incoherently, curled into a fetal ball, deep in the final stages of hypothermia. He wasn't wearing his gloves. His face was lacerated, not by tearing flesh, but by his own fingernails, ragged from scrabbling at his skin. When the paramedics stabilized him, all he would do was whisper the same phrase over and over, his voice cracked and raw. It tastes like me. It tastes like me. It tastes like hunger. He had been chewing on the tips of his own frozen mittens, trying to swallow the wool, trying to feed the emptiness he'd experienced. The doctors said it was an extreme form of paradoxical undressing, combined with survival psychosis. I think Mike tasted the cold, and the cold tasted him. I went back to Jerry's cab, ignoring Frank's worried calls. I had one last desperate hope: the dash cam. Jerry was meticulous about his equipment. I knew he had a continuous loop SD card in there.
Misdid his fingers, even through the heavy glove liners, were clumsy with dread as I located the camera, pulled the card, and shoved it deep into the pocket of my parka. This felt like stealing evidence, but the official investigation, which insisted on accidental exposure exacerbated by alcohol, was useless. They wouldn't look at the truth staring them in the face. They needed a body. I needed an explanation. I didn't watch the footage until I was back in my own truck, parked miles away at a refueling station near the main highway junction, safely nestled among half a dozen other rigs. Safety in numbers, even though I knew the creature probably viewed our cluster of trucks as a smorgasbord, not a deterrent. I loaded the card onto my hardened laptop, the screen illuminating the dark cab. The footage was standard, dull highway video, blowing snow, dark road, the occasional frozen tree flashing past. Jerry was listening to a classic rock station, humming slightly. Then came the static.
At precise 3:18 a.m., our radio went the music to pure electronic screech. Jerry cursed lightly and reached for the volume, turning it down, but the background white noise persisted. He checked his mirrors. Nothing. He checked the side window. Still nothing. The camera, fixed forward, recorded the light dusting of snow falling onto the hood. At 3:21 a.m., the internal cabin microphone picked up the clicking. It was the same sound I had heard, dry, brittle, like bones tapping on frozen slate, originating somewhere to the left of the cab. Jerry stopped humming. He grabbed his high beams lever and flashed them repeatedly into the dark forest. "Who's there?" he muttered, his voice tight with confusion, not panic. The clicking intensified, growing louder, closer. The truck was still rolling slowly, Jerry having only just begun to pull over. At 3:22 a.m., the truck stopped completely. The engine note dropped to a steady, heavy idle.
The interior light flickered on as Jerry opened the driver's side door, probably intending to check the air lines or the tires, assuming some mechanical fault. The camera recorded the empty blackness outside for exactly 7 seconds. Then the whole screen dissolved into violent, fractured static. Not digital pixelation, but pure electromagnetic interference. The audio track, however, briefly cut through the static, and that's where the climax of my terror lodged itself, sharp and cold, into my memory. I heard a sound that was wet and tearing, like heavy canvas ripping, immediately followed by a sound that defied physics and anatomy. A voice that was not air moved by lungs and vocal cords, but the sound of grinding, compacted ice speaking. And it said my name, Elias. The voice was thin, reedy, utterly devoid of warmth, yet it carried an abyssal echo, a profound and ancient hunger. The footage died entirely a second later, the file corrupted beyond recovery.
I sat there in the dark, the laptop screen now blank, the smell of diesel and fear heavy in the air. I hadn't just witnessed Jerry's vanishing. I had been recorded by the thing that took him. It knew my name. It was hunting us by association. This was not a series of unfortunate events. This was a targeted predator, utilizing the isolation of the ice road as its hunting ground. The Wendigo. That was the word the locals had spat out with fear. The spirit of insatiable gluttony, born from cold and desperation. It wasn't interested in the cargo or the truck. It was interested in the human heat, the marrow, the fear, the warmth we generate just to survive the Canadian winter. Jerry was gone. The Phantom 530 was an empty metal shell, and the entity that took him knew exactly who was left on the road. I packed the laptop away, not daring to look out the windows. I was miles from the place, but the silence outside my truck felt heavy, watchful.
You realized I hadn't just uncovered evidence. I had painted a target on my own back. I wasn't an investigator anymore. I was the next delivery. If you'd driven these roads,
if you know the bone-deep chill that settles when the sun dies, you know that the cold is capable of anything. It's an empty canvas for terror. I have more logs, more tapes, and more chilling details about how this thing operates, how it uses the radio, how it disguises its footsteps, and the true horror of what it leaves behind, if it chooses to leave anything at all. The story of the truckers of the frozen north is far from over, but the road is running out. Stay tuned for part 2, where I detail the desperate attempt to track the hunter and the horrific discovery of what happens to the fuel tanks when the Wendigo comes calling. Can you afford to look away? The grinding sound outside the cab was no longer random scraping. It was systematic, investigative.
Iwong a rikimika klon, seeking purchase na reinforced metal seam where the door met the chassis. I hadn't moved in maybe 20 minutes, frozen not just by the air filtering through the gaps in the weather stripping, but by a terror so profound it felt like crystalline structures were forming inside my veins. My breath hitched, sounding impossibly loud in the pressurized silence of the sealed truck, and the windows, already thick with hoarfrost, shimmered faintly from the heat escaping my body. I kept my gaze fixed on the driver's side mirror, though it offered nothing but a fractured silver-gray view of the desolate white wasteland. The light of the half-moon was diffused through the swirling snow, making the world seem painted in shades of sickly blue and black. But the thing wasn't visible. It was too close, pressed against the vehicle, moving with an unnatural, sinuous grace that belied its apparent size. A new sound started.
A soft tapping, almost gentle, right behind the headrest. Tap, not metal on metal, but something harder, denser, like calcified bone, tapping lightly on the fiberglass shell of the sleeper. It sounded inquisitive, almost playful, and that utter lack of vicious urgency was perhaps the most terrifying element of all. It knew I was in here. It was enjoying the wait. Then, the psychological warfare began in earnest. A voice, a sound that shouldn't exist, a dry, reedy whisper dragged across the high-altitude air, came directly from the spot where the tapping ceased. "Jimmy, is that you, old son?" I nearly screamed, biting down so hard on my tongue I tasted copper immediately. Jimmy McNair. He was the first one to vanish, 3 months prior, only 50 miles south of here. His rig was found empty, engine running, the keys still in the ignition.
The voice was a perfect mimicry. The slight lilt, the gravelly texture Jimmy always got after too many years on diesel fumes and cheap coffee. "The tank is dry, Jimmy. I can't start the generator. Are you sleeping in the back?" The voice continued, stretching the vowel sounds unnaturally long, like dry leather pulling apart. It was fishing. It was using the emotional currency of my lost comrades against me, trying to coax me out of the safety of the iron cage. This confirmed the stories, the ancient warnings. The Wendigo doesn't just eat, it preys on sanity. It seeks willing victims, driven mad by cold, hunger, or despair. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to mentally chant the truck's VIN number, anything to block the auditory invasion. Don't respond.
Don't acknowledge the sound. It's not real. It's a trick of the woods. The tapping returned, louder now, impatient. And then the smell hit me, overpowering the faint scent of stale coffee and road salt in the cab.
It was the smell di un mil di winter trapped in one breath, a blast di ozone, frozen moss, a something deeply, inherently corrupted, like meat left too long in the sun, a vein flash frozen. The smell, the hunt of consumption without satisfaction. The sound moved to the passenger door. There was a low, guttural rasp, a sound like dry sandpaper being drawn slowly across the heavy-duty lock mechanism. It wasn't trying to break the lock, it was trying to feel the lock, to understand its resistance. Suddenly, the truck shuddered violently, not a gentle bump, but a massive, jarring heave, as if a bulldozer had impacted the front axle. I was thrown forward against the steering wheel, the horn letting out a truncated, pained blare before I yanked myself back. It had reared up. I could feel the tremendous, bone-jarring weight of the creature pressing against the front hood.
Scrabbled desperately for the only protection I had, a small, intricately carved cedar amulet I had bought from an old Cree woman months ago, mostly as a joke, but now clenched so tightly in my hand that the wood was digging painful crescents into my palm. It was supposed to be a ward against winter spirits, smelling faintly of burning sage and old pine resin. The creature's true form was momentarily visible as it pressed its skeletal face against the windshield, the glass barely holding the weight. It wasn't just tall, it was impossibly elongated, a horrific distortion of a human silhouette, stretched thin and taut over a framework of white, brittle bone. Its skin, where visible, was the color of frozen mud, peeling away to reveal muscles like dried sinew, and the eyes, sunken, starved pits that burned with a faint, malevolent orange light, reflecting the snowscape in tiny, terrifying dots.
The mouth was the worst, a cavernous slit filled with long, needle-like teeth, some chipped, others too perfect, designed only for tearing and stripping. But the most disturbing detail, the one that broke my sanity a little more, was the antlers, not the majestic rack of a deer, but the grotesque spiked protrusions of bone growing out of its skull, covered in a thin velvet membrane that looked cold to the touch. It was the crown of the starving king of the northern woods. It let out a breath, and a plume of frigid mist enveloped the cab, instantly reforming into a thick layer of internal ice on the already frosted glass. I couldn't see anything, but I knew exactly where it was. The silence returned, more crushing than the sound. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs, an erratic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. Then the final attack began. The pressure shifted from the hood to the roof of the cab.
I heard the sickening screech of metal twisting, and the realization hit me. The thin aluminum plating of the roof was the weak point. It was peeling the cab like a can of sardines. I lunged into the sleeper, grabbing a heavy-duty wrench, a 10-pound monster of forged steel. I heard the sickening screech of metal twisting, and the realization hit me.
The thin aluminum plating of the roof was the weak point. It was peeling the cab like a can of sardines. I lunged into the sleeper, grabbing a heavy-duty wrench, a 10-pound monster of forged steel, useless against an entity of myth, but necessary for the illusion of fighting back. Before I could turn, a segment of the roof above the passenger seat tore inward with a violent, deafening crack. Snow, ice, and splintered fiberglass rained down on the seat. The hole was just large enough for the creature to begin pushing through. A massive, skeletal hand dropped into the opening, instantly radiating an unbearable, unnatural cold that made the air around it shimmer. The fingers were long, unnervingly delicate, ending in claws that looked more like polished obsidian blades than keratin. I reacted purely on instinct, a primitive surge overriding the paralyzing fear.
It screamed a raw, desperate noise that tore my throat and swung the wrench upward with all the desperate strength of a man who knew this was his last second. The wrench struck the wrist of the creature. There was no blood, no meaty impact, only the jarring resistance of hardened bone. But the sound, oh God, the sound was a high-pitched, resonant snap, followed by a shriek that wasn't human, not animal, but the sound of tortured air itself. A high, thin wail that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath the truck. The arm instantly retracted. The creature was wounded, but not physically bleeding. It was leaking an energy, a concentrated cold that seemed to vaporize the very moisture in the air. I scrambled back, climbing over the driver's seat, wrench still gripped tightly. I had heard it. I had proven that crude terrestrial force, when applied unexpectedly, could damage the mythological flesh. But it was enraged now.
The initial playfulness was gone, replaced by a devastating, visceral fury. The creature ripped the remaining roof panel away entirely. The cab was suddenly exposed to the elements, flooded with moonlight and swirling snow. Standing on the hood, leaning over the ravaged space, the Wendigo loomed, taller than the truck itself. The fractured arm hung uselessly, but its focus was absolute, its orange eyes blazing with lethal hunger, locked on to me. I could see the steam rising from its body, not heat, but the cold it exuded, boiling the ambient moisture. It lowered its head, and the smell intensified to a paralyzing degree. I could see the minute movements of its jaws, anticipating the kill. There was no time for tactics, no time for prayer. I looked at the cedar amulet still clutched in my left hand, the wood feeling strangely warm despite the overwhelming cold. Fire. The legends always mention fire or the sacred smoke. I needed heat. I needed light.
My eyes scanned the ravaged cabin frantically. The road flares. I always kept in tuck behind the passenger seat, a standard issue, but rarely used. With the creature momentarily hesitant, observing the damage and calculating its final leap, I dropped to the wrench, dove across the floor,
and tore the flare container open. I fumbled, my fingers clumsy with golden shock, pulling out to the largest, thickest flare. I heard the heavy, scratching sound of the creature shifting its weight for the attack. It was coming, now. I managed to twist the striker cap and pull, the chemical fuse catching with an immediate, furious whoosh. The flare ignited, casting a brilliant, blinding crimson light across the cap and the snowscape. I didn't think about aiming or throwing. I simply held the hissing, roaring column of red flame high above my head, a desperate, defiant beacon against the unending darkness. The effect was instantaneous and horrific.
The light, and more importantly, the concentrated, non-natural heat, struck the Wendigo like a physical blow. The creature didn't recoil so much as shrivel. The area of its body hit by the direct blazing heat, its torso and the side of its face began to smoke. Not the steamy smoke of condensation, but the acrid smell of burnt sulfur and something ancient, something that shouldn't be consumed by earthly flame. The Wendigo shrieked again, a sound of agony and betrayal, far louder than before, resonating in my chest. It stumbled backward off the hood, the sheer heat proving intolerable. It landed heavily in the snow, churning the powder into a cloud, but it did not run. It stood crouched, momentarily blinded by the blinding red light, its huge skeletal form casting long, dancing shadows. I knew this was my only chance. Survival was not about killing it. It was about moving faster than the myth.
I scrambled back into the driver's seat, the flare still burning fiercely in my left hand, illuminating the shattered dashboard. The keys were still there. Miraculously, the engine still functioned, idling faithfully beneath the damaged hood. With my right hand, I slammed the transmission into the lowest gear, grinding the mechanism painfully, and then stomped on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, dragging itself out of the snowbank. I didn't turn the wheel. I didn't look back. I simply held the flare out the broken window, aiming the brilliant red beam directly at the creature as I accelerated. The last image I saw in my periphery was the Wendigo rising from the snow, its body momentarily illuminated in the intense red glare, its expression one of pure, thwarted hunger, its antlered head tilted as if calculating the velocity needed to intercept me. I drove faster than any human being should drive a fully loaded semi on black ice and packed snow.
Drove until our red light of the flare finally sputtered and died, leaving me in our relative blessed darkness of the road lamps. That drove until the engine began to protest, until the memory of the scream was distant enough that I could unclench my jaw. That drove until our rising sun, a pathetic pale disk above the horizon, finally started to touch the high points of the spruce trees. I reached the next outpost, a tiny fuel stop called the Last Chance, looking like I had clawed my way out of a grave. The attendant, a burly man named Gus, took one look at the sheared-off roof of my cab and a wild terror in my eyes, and didn't ask a single question. He simply poured me a coffee and put a bottle of strong rye on the counter. I didn't tell him about the Wendigo. I didn't tell him about Jimmy McNair's voice.
You told them I hit a massive buck that tore the top off the rig before running off into the woods, and that the force of the impact had made me throw a flare inside the cab out of panic. Gus nodded slowly, looking out at the woods.
understanding the code. Something happened out there that can't be explained. The authorities eventually filed my report. A major wildlife collision and severe structural damage due to operator error and poor conditions. They never found the antlered beast, nor did they look particularly hard. They just closed the files on the missing truckers, marking them as victims of the endless, hungry North. But I know what I saw. I know what whispered Jimmy's name into the darkness. I survived. I replaced the truck. I fixed the damage, reinforcing every seam, welding extra steel into the roof, and I added a sophisticated, commercial-grade external fire suppression system, mounted high. Overkill, yes, but necessary. I don't hold those routes anymore.
We stick to the lower 48, where the lights are brighter and the winter doesn't feel like a predatory conscious entity. But sometimes, when the engine is droning late at night and the fog rolls in thick and white, I look into the deep darkness beyond the reach of my headlights, and I smell it, just a faint lingering hint of ozone and corruption cutting through the diesel. And I wonder if the blast of fire was just a temporary setback. The cold up there, that deep, isolating winter, doesn't just kill the body, it preserves the hunger. And I know with a chilling certainty that settles deep in my bones that somewhere up on that frozen ribbon of asphalt, the Wendigo still waits, healing, starving, and listening for the sound of an engine that dares to intrude upon its kingdom. It knows my name now, and the North remembers its debts.
If you ever find yourself running the northern routes, and the engine starts to cough, or you hear a voice calling from the silent woods that sounds exactly like a friend you lost years ago, don't stop. Don't look back, and for God's sake, keep a flare burning, because the hunger of the North is not just physical, it is eternal, and it calls to the lonely hearts of men who drive the long, dark road, and it's still out there, always listening.